joining us today. Lee?
Thanks very much, Lisa, and I'd like to welcome and thank everyone for listening in today. I want to start by doing a special shout out to my colleagues at RMA, Stacy Germano and Shay Scarpa, who helped a great deal with this presentation, along with my colleagues here at AFS, Bill Sonnen and Tara Doyle. This is the 9th time we have conducted this data quality survey between AFS and RMA jointly, and we've done it every year since 2007 with the exceptions of 2011 and 2013, but we have done it regularly every year since 2013. We believe we have a unique focus on this survey, and that is to examine how banks perceive their own data, how they govern it, and what steps they are taking to improve it to the point that they do want to improve it. We have conducted this survey at the end of last year, between early November and mid-December. We had 32 questions on our survey. We sent it to banks globally and specifically directed it to people who had data, credit, or risk management responsibilities with their jobs. We got 26 responses from North America and Europe as a result of that. And as you can see at the bottom of the page, almost 70% of the respondents represented the risk management function at their banks. Pardon me. There we go. And one unique feature of our survey is that the participants in the survey do receive the entire full written report, complete with answers to all of the questions from the survey. Banks that have not participated in the survey have to content themselves with listening to me do a recital here of the highlights of the survey. So what is our survey really all about? Well, in a nutshell, it deals with data that supports effective credit risk management. As you can see from the graphic, we deal in our survey with the data support needs and governance that are below the waterline in this picture. So in order for banks to effectively measure the risks in their credit portfolios, to get up-to-date current information about their positions and exposures, to be able to forecast and respond to changes in exposure when they do change, and to manage those exposures, they must depend on and be able to rely upon the quality of the data that supports them. So our survey has a number of questions that ask banks to define and judge their data qualities, to tell us what policies and procedures they have in place to manage it, and in particular what new initiatives or improvement steps they're taking in those cases where they feel that their data does need improvement. We began last year to support the theory or the position that this is really a journey that banks are upon of improving their data quality. We find that it involves incremental, steady progress in improving their data, and usually, in most cases, this journey began perhaps 8 or 9 or 10 years ago in the financial crisis, when regulators determined that they couldn't rely upon the accuracy of data portfolios at banks, and began issuing MRAs, enforcement actions, and so forth. But that spark of data enlightenment, I might call it, or perhaps even data enforcement, is really what began the journey. This journey, as you can see, consists of 4 principal stages. We think that banks are probably in the second red stage right now. For a number of years, they have been asking the strategic questions about what kind of quality they have, how do they align data with their business strategic priorities, One of the first steps, as we will see in a few slides from now, that banks have taken is to appoint a single individual with enterprise-wide responsibility for data management. And this will lead, in the second stage, the red box, to steps to improve the validation, the consistency of data, providing better automated controls in their data and credit processes, and updating technology in a number of cases to improve the transparency of their data lineage and to move toward what they call one version of the truth that we will get into later. And these stages then progress, as banks are beginning to do now, with looking into artificial intelligence, robotics, other fintech innovations, advanced analytics. And all of this then leads to a better quality and more actionable data. Data is moving at banks from being purely descriptive to being more predictive about what banks could look forward to as next actions in their portfolios or what risks are just around the corner. And finally, the intent is to try to move data toward a more prescriptive stage where it can offer recommendations for better returns and better business decisions. Each of these stages serves not only as an important step forward in its own right, but perhaps even more important, it serves as a necessary and critical precondition to enable the succeeding stage. Hence, then, the critical nature of the underlying data quality itself as the most important factor that will make or break the success of artificial intelligence and other innovative data breakthroughs. So, getting to the key questions that are in our survey, we organized them into a few different groups. The first group of questions focused squarely on banks' opinions and attitudes and internal judgments about their data quality. And as we can see from this very first question in the survey, we ask whether data is a higher strategic priority this year than it was last year. And as you can see, for the past 3 years, banks have been steadily increasing their priority of data quality to the point where now over 80% of the banks that answered the survey indicated that it was a higher priority strategically than it was the year before. A number of articles, white papers, stories in the industry media support this, and these are all dedicated to data and its strategic value. I inserted as well here a couple of quotations that were heard or spoken at the Sibos conference in Toronto last October, where a number of sessions and presentations really were focused on the critical centrality of data and its overall value. So this recognition of the higher strategic value of data brings us to what we usually consider the headline chart in our survey, and that is this one. We always have asked banks to assess their confidence in their own data. There are 4 ratings that we can ask banks to choose. They can either rate their own data as excellent, as above average but trending upward, as average with a number of problems that need to be addressed, and the final category, which for polite society we'll simply call not so good. As you can see on this chart, last year there was a very, very large jump in confidence that banks expressed in their own data after a couple of years of decline that we had attributed to a lot of the stress test activities and the recognition that regulators were indeed very intense and tough on their data requirements. With such a large jump, we wondered whether it was really justified, what the factor or factors might have been for that large jump. But this year the confidence level stayed right up there, so we see that it was a valid and justifiable increase. Banks this year did not have any excellent ratings about their own data, but a number of them, in fact a large increase in banks, had rated their data as average unlike previous years where they had not had so large a number in that particular category. For the first time this year also in our survey, we broke out the answers to several questions by the asset size of the banks that were responding. We broke the banks into two separate groupings, those that were under 50 billion, either euros, dollars, or pounds, or whatever local currency they have, and those that were over 50 billion in size. And you can see here a significant difference in the levels of confidence. The larger banks, the ones in red, the ones on the right-hand side, expressed generally a higher level of confidence, i.e. there were more that rated their own data as above average than the smaller banks on the left. We suspect this might be due to the fact that larger banks have had a greater history and more intense involvement with regulatory scrutiny, and therefore they've had more time to devote toward improving their data and hence their confidence associated with it. We asked as well what banks saw as the major impediments to best practices in data quality. And this is an interesting slide. It shows a 5-year history of responses to this particular question. And we're noticing that in the past couple of years, two factors have taken the lead as the most important impediments to data management. Inadequate system functionality and the competition from budgeting priorities, as well as manual workarounds, have become, in the past year or two, the leading problems for data quality. Whether this is a factor that's going to remain, whether it may be a temporary blip, we're not quite sure, so we're going to keep following this question in coming years. But you'll see on the left-hand side of these bars that the issues of data consistency and information silos that had been the leading problems for a few years have been giving way. Now, this may be due to the fact that improvement efforts that banks have been putting into place to clean up and improve their data may be having some effect as a result of those. So perhaps they are recognizing that technological and system problems may be the ones that they have to contend with next. For nearly every survey that we've done, we've asked the respondents to indicate how they perceive the level of support for data quality improvement among their own executive officers. This had an interesting result this year in that it appeared that the banks that are over 50 billion had a somewhat greater or more responsive level of support from their executives, unlike the smaller banks where there wasn't any real pattern of support. But the chart on the bottom of the page, I think, was very interesting. We took the very first survey back in 2007 and compared the results to this question to those from this year, and you can see quite a difference in the level of strong, vocal, active support that's perceived to be coming from executive management, much higher now than it was 10 years ago, which would be indicative of the overall shift toward recognition of data. This particular question also, these 2 or 3 questions have been asked for a number of years in the survey as well. We sprinkled throughout the survey a number of statements to which we asked banks to respond whether they agree or disagree. And this particular set poses a very interesting and peculiar response. While 89% of banks say that their bank does recognize and manage credit risk effectively, the pie chart on the right tells us that only 31% believe that their data quality policies and procedures are well managed. That's a peculiar situation, but even despite that, a full 69% say that the bank employees do understand and support the efforts to improve data quality as a strategic priority. Why the continued voice that policies are not well managed remains something of a mystery, but this has been fairly steady for a few years, and we'll keep following this in future surveys. One of the first things that we noticed that banks undertook a few years ago in response to their data efforts was the establishment of either a chief data officer or a very similar role that's equivalent to that, with one person having bank-wide, enterprise-wide responsibility for data management. That position has steadily increased among the banks that participate over the past several years, to the point where it's up over 60% of banks that have a CDO or equivalent, as well as a written set of governance and data management strategy that accompany it. Here's an interesting case where smaller banks differ significantly from the larger banks about how they're handling this situation. Notice that the prevalence of a chief data officer is much more among the larger banks than it is among the smaller ones. And those banks also closely associate the presence of that role with the adoption of an enterprise-level governance strategy. For the first time this year, our survey then asked, all right, given the presence of a chief data officer, what are the primary responsibilities of that role? And we've ordered the responses from high to low this year. The red bar simply indicates those banks that don't have a CDO, so this particular question wasn't applicable to them. But you can see that the role of a CDO, at least for now, as banks are getting that position pretty well solidified, the role and responsibilities seems to be more tactical in nature than it is strategic. By tactical, I mean a very high prevalence of responsibilities such as executing the improvement plans, taking the lead to make sure that the plans are funded and carried out, while the strategic responsibilities would be those that are involving driving the strategy for data, establishing data standards, identifying new business opportunities, etc. We're expecting that this shift toward more strategic responsibilities, or at least the inclusion of more strategic responsibilities, will continue to shift as the position remains and becomes much more comfortable within the organization. Now, since we talk about credit risk data, we obviously ask then several questions about data at its source in the credit process and what responsibilities and factors are responsible for that. And this poses another interesting set of results, that whereas banks recognize credit product management in the upper left as a distinct responsibility, that responsibility doesn't seem to carry over to the credit process workflow itself. As you can see in these other pie charts, there is no single role or business unit that has responsibility for the entire front-to-back credit delivery process. There is no one organization that has responsibility for addressing the completeness and accuracy of data throughout that credit process. And finally, we have asked the question about linkage to executive compensation a number of times, and the answer has consistently been at a very low level. In this case, only about 11% of the respondents have any linkage to executive compensation. It simply seems not to be an important factor, at least still. The next group of questions in the survey focused on issues related to technology and systems and operations as they impacted data quality. This first question in that group is one that we've had in the survey for a number of years as well. And again, we've ordered the responses from left to right based on the percentage of banks indicated they were a particular challenge. And you can see in these responses a division between issues that are purely technological or operational, and some other issues that I would be calling either organizational or budgetary. In other words, factors that are the result of the bank's business organization, policies and procedures, and those often come through even when we're asking questions about technology and operations as persistent challenges. For example, data consistency, the accessibility of data from one business to another across business lines, the prevalence of informational silos and the challenges that they pose to data are issues that I would call organizational. But they do have a very large impact on technology and operations and have remained at or near the top of this list for a number of years. This is a somewhat different perspective on that same question, and we ask about issues around the data flow through the credit process. We've identified those stages or functions where data moves from the beginning to the end of the credit process, and we've asked banks to identify where, at which stages data encounters problems. As you might imagine, the point of initial entry into the credit process is far and away the most problematic spot for banks. But the one that comes in second, again, no real surprise, is where data gets booked into the servicing system. Because in most banks now, that booking is still done manually, which creates a large opportunity for error. This is another one where we separated the responses among larger and smaller banks. But you can see, interestingly, on the right-hand side of this chart, larger banks have also cited the issue of data that moves from system to system, particularly toward the end of the process, where data is moved into data warehouses or other reporting data sets for either compliance or business reporting. And among the larger banks, it would be expected that they would have some problems here because of the complexity, the number of systems involved, the larger portfolios and the more complex data that's involved in those portfolios. So they recognize those movements as more problematic than smaller banks would. And finally, another question in that same vein about where problems are occurring in the credit process. We asked what principal activities or a lack thereof are responsible for causing many of those data quality problems. And this is a case where, again, a couple of issues point out much more than the others. Manual intervention and the lack of data validation at the initial point of entry are the two that are much more problematic than others. Manual intervention means that data has to be re-entered at various points along the credit process where it isn't carried forward automatically through an automatic interface, but has to get taken out of one system and then manually entered into another. And where data is not validated at the initial point of entry, that often means that a unit farther down the process and farther removed from the source of the data would have to try to perform that validation entry, and often without access to the source documents involved in that, which creates or perpetuates data problems. When data has to be aggregated from multiple source systems, that often creates issues of quality as well. And this is another question that has been asked repeatedly since the beginning of the survey. We ask whether banks have a single repository, a data warehouse, a data lake, or some other structure where they put data that's going to be used subsequently for regulatory compliance or management reporting. 35% of the banks that responded to the survey say they do have a single system repository. But then we went further and asked how many systems feed into that single repository. And the answer in many cases is, to put it simply, a lot of systems do. 72% of the banks reported that they have at least 10, and in some cases an uncertain number of systems that are feeding their credit risk data warehouse. This large number of systems feeding into their warehouse has been fairly consistent since the beginning of the survey. We're making slow but fairly steady progress. When I checked the 2007 results, I noticed that there were a few banks that actually reported something well over 100 systems feeding into their single data warehouse. So you can imagine the prevalence of a number of quality problems when that happens. Now, here is where we start to see in our survey some increased confidence and optimism showing through a number of these technological problems that I've just been recounting. Despite the fact that banks have a number of technological issues or operational issues involving manual entry and lack of validation, banks are reporting that they are still effectively getting what they need from their credit data. We've asked for a few years whether banks feel that their data system capabilities are up to snuff with the Basel 239 principles about aggregation and reporting. There still is a minority of banks reporting on the survey that say that they are compliant with those principles. But nonetheless, banks reported by very large margins that they're confident that they are getting what they need from their credit systems. Their material is adequate, it's easily accessible, and they're quite happy, or I shouldn't say happy, but I should say confident that their systems are able to deliver the credit that's needed. We still ask whether banks are getting their credit risk data updated in real time. Again, it's a very small number of banks that are able to do that, but that doesn't seem to have affected their confidence or optimism about their credit quality. The final group of questions that we ask has to do with initiatives or projects that banks are undertaking to improve their credit risk data. We've asked this question for a few years, but only in the past couple we've started asking what benefits banks are getting from those particular projects. We've asked them whether they are achieving the expectations that they set when they were first met. 40% of the banks that responded said that they have either surpassed or mostly met the expectations that they had put in place for those projects. We asked what has driven or been responsible for the initiation of those projects. Risk management came in with the most responses at 36%. Interestingly, only 4% of the banks cited cost reduction as the need for their improvement efforts. So they were largely, if not entirely, focused on risk and other compliance concerns when they put these in place. We asked whether banks thought that their improvements were temporary or sustainable, and 64% said that they are lasting and sustainable. So that's quite a surprise. We've asked for several years now whether banks feel that they have, quote, one version of the truth with their credit data. That phrase is subject, of course, to interpretation from one bank to the next, but we are more or less evenly split, 57-42, about whether they do. This year, a somewhat larger number indicated that they do have one version of the truth. It was 57%. Last year, 47% said that that was the case. And as you can see, there's very little difference in the responses between larger banks and smaller banks about that. So overall, from year to year, with this series of do you agree or disagree with this statement type of questions that we've had in the survey, we've been noticing a significant and sustained movement toward stronger alignment, support, and confidence in their data quality, which leads us to believe that on their journey, banks are making perhaps slow, but steady progress with it. The fact that this question about one version of the truth has been becoming a bit stronger every year leads us to believe that it's probably time to explore what banks really mean by that. So next year we're going to ask some further questions about what benefits and results actually are coming from that. So the final slide of charts that we have indicates that despite the fact that banks feel they don't have sufficient resources in-house to populate and work on the number of initiatives they have, they still feel that they're making headway. Again, a more or less even split about accepting responsibility as the first line of defense among the business lines. Banks have been reporting for a number of years running that their investment in data quality efforts is higher than it was the previous year. Nonetheless, they continue to say 56% to 44% that their investment still is not large enough. It can keep growing. But they do agree that their data is good enough. Again, by a fairly large margin, 73%. Their data is good enough to satisfy regulators and customer expectations. So to summarize our findings from this year's survey, we see, as we've mentioned, a sustained higher level of confidence, a recognition across virtually all areas of the banks, including executive management, that this is a higher priority. Chief data officers are pretty near universal now at banks. The improvement efforts are showing some sustained progress, and again, despite the challenges that banks feel they have, their optimism is showing through that they are able to achieve what they're getting, and that data quality is good enough. But of course, that takes us to the question of what good enough really does mean. So here are some issues that we've begun thinking about for next year and future surveys. Again, we have reached the point where we think we need to begin asking banks how they're using the improved data that they're claiming they see. What business benefit are they deriving from a higher level of data quality? The two pie charts we have here reflect a couple of questions we had at the end of the survey that are beginning to address that score. We asked if banks feel that they have been able to monetize any data quality improvements. Very few said that they have been able to. and an even smaller percentage said that data quality is now considered a competitive differentiator at their bank. So these are where we want to take some questions in future years, and we want to take this opportunity now to thank all of you for staying through with us on behalf of AFS and the RMA. We'd like to invite you to participate in next year's survey, where you will be able to receive the full results, including all of the questions and answers. And one final plug I would like to make is to ask you all to be on the lookout for an article that's going to be appearing in the RMA Journal about this survey. That will be coming out shortly. I urge you all to grab it quickly when it does arrive, because I'm sure it's going to fly off the shelves. And on that, I'd like to thank you again for joining, and I'll be happy to try to answer any questions you may have.
We're going to put everybody on mute for a second and just check our questions, so if you can just hold on for a minute. Okay, it looks like we don't have any questions for today. To answer a few, people did ask about a hard copy being provided, and we will be sending out an email tomorrow with a link to download a copy of the presentation and also to listen to the recording if you like. So that will conclude today's webinar, and thank you everybody for joining us.